Hi, and welcome back to Griffith Realty's podcast of Land and Legacy. I'm Scott Griffith, the president of Griffith Realty, and my sister Carol, vice president, is here with me. And we have a special guest today, and I'm going to let Carol introduce our special guest. Go ahead, Carol.
I'm very pleased to have with us our Drain Commissioner for Livingston County, Brian Jonckheere. And Brian can tell us a little bit more about his job, but I've respected Brian and his position for years. He's been our Drain Commissioner in Livingston County since 1996. He comes to us with a wealth of knowledge. One thing I think is particularly valuable in his position is that he's a fourth generation resident here in Livingston County. So he's been in your backyard, I'm sure. He's been in everyone's backyard.
Knows where your water went.
He knows exactly where the water is and where it went. So I know that you've also held some big positions in Lansing, and that comes because of your good leadership capability and your educational background, and that you do a job so well. So anyway, we're proud to have you here in Livingston County. We're proud to have you this afternoon on our podcast, Brian. And
thanks for having me.
So you got to tell everybody what a drain commissioner is first, because to be frank, I'm sure they've heard the name. They probably don't know what you're actually doing.
And there's the one advantage of being called drain commissioner is not a whole lot of people want to run for your position. So there is one benefit. But yeah, drain commissioners are pretty unique to the state of Michigan. Michigan being probably the fifth wettest state in the union. So we're pretty unique. It is an elected position because of its ability to levy special assessments, and hence that's why it's elected. The state has a very long history of drainage. This was at one point really deemed uninhabitable in the original Surveyor General, saying that it wasn't worth the cost to drain the land.
Really?
So, that's fascinating.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so it's unique among the states, although there are some similar positions that do roughly the same thing, but drain commissioners are pretty much unique, and it came about actually started as township drain commissioners back in the early 1800s. And then went to township and county drain commissioners, and eventually county drain commissioners. And we still retain, if a drain was established back in 1850, we still retain the authority and the responsibility to maintain those. So some of ours go back, I believe, into the early 1850s.
And so when you have an authority in a drain, because we're in real estate, we have some familiarity with this. Essentially, you have for lack of a better term, an easement right across properties that doesn't matter how ownership's been passing, it's retained this drainage easement is what we call it, right?
That's correct. Very similar to a road right of way in a lot of instances. Many cases, property owners own to the middle of the road, but
Sure.
The easement allows the road commission to maintain that roadway. And the same is for county drains. Not all drains, but anything that was petitioned by the people and establishes a county drain. So, so we really just have the authority to be on there to maintain it. But so if we're in a unique position, as we're in the backyards of people quite often, maintaining drains with heavy equipment and cutting trees and everything. So you can imagine a lot of people are pretty sensitive to a government organization being
showing up in your backyard digging holes.
Unannounced.
So on the agricultural side, that's not a problem. They say, get in here and clean it and go. Once we move into backyards and subdivisions, it's a whole new ball game.
Well, and I've talked about this, but for our listeners, so in the agricultural side, farmers are famous for what they call tiling fields. And for people that don't know this, fields tend to hold water in low spots, and so the farmers go in and they put in underground tiling, and they rely on the drain commissioners and the drains because they take the water and move it to these county drains, which then you're directing that water to watersheds wherever. But for farmers, it's been crucial for their ability to farm the lands that are around here, thanks to our great clay in some areas and so forth. So,
absolutely. And one of probably the most common thing, I think yesterday, I had 2 calls on this where somebody was wondering why their property is all of a sudden wet. Never used to be. So we can look back actually at aerials going back to 1940, and you can see nice field. You can see that there's dark areas where the wetlands used to be, but those were tiled by farmers. So if you think, we have 500-600 miles of county drains. That's a small part of the private drainage in this county that's actually vitrified clay tile, and those tiles, to some extent, are still working. So a lot of this ground is being drained by infrastructure that's well over 100 years old and still working, but it's crumbling. And so you have people that have moved into property or onto a property that was dry maybe for years, and now all of a sudden it's getting wetter and wetter and wetter. And that's really tough. And they don't understand that because they may have moved from the city where drainage fell completely under the authority of the municipality. And one thing in moving out to Livingston County, they don't realize is they gave up the taxes. They know that taxes went down, but what they often don't know is they've purchased that responsibility to maintain drainage. So by law, if there's a drain moving through your property and it's plugged, it usually affects your neighbor up the hill, and you have a responsibility to maintain that.
Interesting.
Now, it doesn't normally happen that way,
Yeah.
and then it unfortunately ends up in the courts because the courts are the only arbiter of private drainage. But that's something we see most commonly here is that failing drainage infrastructure and those properties where things are changing, getting wetter.
So just using that example, do they call you and you fix it down if it's outside of their parameter, or is it do they need to be going in the backyard and trying to figure out where the tile is that might have failed? How does that tend to work? Because I'm not sure what happens when you start seeing it build up.
It really is, because we don't have any authority to be on private property.
Sure,
Similar to a road commission, they cannot shouldn't be on a private road.
Right.
And if something happens, they're totally responsible for that. So we can't legally go in and spend any money to work on a private drain. But normally what we'll do is we can look at aerials, sometimes get an idea where that tile is, because you can see where it was trenched in sometimes based on the aerials, and give them some suggestions about maybe running a tile, working with a neighbor to get that permission, what have you. Or if there's a county drain nearby, that makes it quite easy for us.
Yeah. I know, so a little fun fact I've always loved about Livingston County is we have our watershed goes to 3 Great Lakes in this county, and it's like one of those facts that nobody ever realizes until you start to talk about it. But the Red Cedar runs out to Lake Michigan, of course, and we got Lake Huron and Lake Erie shed. So that's fun. It's really cool. So how do you, I know part of your role, part of what you're concerned about, because I know you're concerned about it, is keeping our quality of our water in good quality, not allowing things to contaminate. What things do you do that to help us keep that watershed clean?
Yeah, and the drain code, which is what I work under, and its last major codification was 1956, so it's dated. And while it's vague and it gives us some authority to do that, we have limited authority to do environmental enhancements and assess the people.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's usually left to the state, and it gets kind of complicated because under the Clean Water Act, we're doing watershed management, and some of those things are coming around. But really where we see that is in the rules that our office and the municipalities adopt for new developments, making sure that the water goes through some type of treatment in the basins before it gets to the waterways, that type of thing. And those are helpful. Just the awareness. When I started as drain commissioner, I think there was probably one township supervisor that could name the 3 major drainages in Livingston County, or define a watershed.
Even what
And a lot of them are very much involved in the watershed management. And interestingly, we have a very small sliver in northwest Conway Township that drains to the Looking Glass River, which is also tributary to the Grand, like the Red Cedar.
No,
yes.
I didn't know that. That's great.
Interesting.
That's very cool stuff. Yeah. So so what are some of the big issues right now that you're dealing with? So we're talking about weather and climate change, there seems to be more, at times there's more water at a greater volume. How should I say? It comes down quicker than it used to or something, or in more volume. So does that affect you? Yeah.
Big time. Yeah. It's really one of those enormous unknowns, and that's just us. It's road commissions. It's MDOT. What we are seeing, and I forget what the figures are in the last 20 years, we've seen a pretty substantial, like a 15% increase in storm intensity. And so what that means is, those all-day soakers that we used to get, the light rain, we don't usually get those much anymore. We get the torrential downpours, an inch in 15 minutes. And that makes that changes the whole scenario here, because the water runs off instead of sinking in, and it doesn't supply the stream with that. Everything runs to the stream, so streams surge very quickly and then slowly and then recede. Whereas before we had all the houses and everything else here, it would just slowly climb and then slowly, it would go down because it'd be fed by groundwater. And that's all changing with development and the changes in the rainfall events, and it's expected to get worse. So you probably remember some of these instances in the last 5 years where we've seen parts of down by the city in 96 and up 75 up. I think portions were flooded in 69. Right. And I don't remember ever hearing about those. The infrastructure that's in place today, which may have been in a county drain scenario, may have been sized for a 10-year storm, which is, actually more like a 2-year or less storm. So, and that was at a time when there was hardly any development. So these are sized for very, very small rain events. And when we get the large ones, they're always overwhelmed.
Wow. Yeah. I'm sure people know what I'm talking about, but we have so much more roads. We have and roofs, which are impervious surfaces. So then it makes all this water collect to locations. In other words, forced to a certain location, correct? And that's the challenge, right? And then we've got to figure out. And there's rules about in development the retention of the water and having it drain out at the same pace it came off the property before they did that. And I always look back and go, I don't see how you ever get to that actual standard. You know what I mean? I just can't imagine it ever gets to that. Now, I know they try. You see retention ponds, detention ponds, all these things. But I go, man, how do you ever keep it at the same way when it goes on the next property,
Well, what you're effectively doing is you're throttling the rate. So how much water is coming off per unit of time. Sure. So, 500 gallons a minute or 200 gallons a minute. So you're replicating what it was pre-construction, but what you're also doing, because of development, you're sending more water. So that's going to occur over a longer period of time. So you're right. Anytime we have this development, unless you have really, really sandy soils and some engineered basins or something else to incorporate water, you're always sending more water. And so it's a point we always make, because we have anybody that has water sitting after a storm, they want it gone within 10 minutes. Sure. The drains were constructed with one purpose when they were constructed, is that was to get water off the fields in 24 hours to avoid crops being killed.
Right.
And that's important, that water stays on the land, because whenever we take that water and put it into a drain, somebody else gets it. And especially, one thing that we see most often on the we look at those TV reports with somebody standing on the roof of their house along the Mississippi.
Yeah.
And water's going through their second floor bedroom. And we don't think we're part of that. Well, we are. The rooftops and the driveways we've put here, also Wisconsin and Iowa and all on the upper Mississippi, that water increases the amount of water, so they get more of the flooding. So the water that fell on your roof in western Livingston County may be, in some years, going through somebody's second floor bedroom in the floodplain along the Mississippi. And we don't realize that our activities here, any single house is irrelevant, but add them all together and we have pretty substantial impacts downstream.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So we talked earlier, and I know you're a bit of a historian on it. It's just fascinating to me, the whole concept that we were so wet at one point in that. I mean, you were saying earlier that we were just like giant swamps out here is what you pretty much have heard. Is that the situation?
Yeah, I think the general consensus, I don't know how they measure this, is that we were the 5th wettest state in the union. And the original surveyor general that came through, I think his comments to the to Congress were the Michigan it wasn't worth the cost to drain it, is what he said. Wow. And there were signs along the borders with Indiana and Indiana and Ohio that said, "Don't go to Michigan, this land of ills." The word means ague, fever, and chills, which is really a reference to malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases. So, and then there was actually, after the Civil War, the federal government was giving soldiers land, and there was Michigan, I think Illinois, and another state that they were predominantly giving land to. So the soldiers would get a piece of land, a deed, and show up here in Michigan, and it was all underwater. And the federal government at the time got a black eye for this, so they closed that program and shunted those people to other states. So they got a black eye from trying to pawn some swampland off on our Civil War veterans.
It probably explains why, if you look at some of the really early maps of Michigan, they just had it all distorted because I think they couldn't get across it very well and they couldn't measure very well because there's all these distortions until they finally could start doing aerials and get real survey equipment, it seems like. Yeah. So the peninsula was a little narrower back in the old days.
Yeah, it was. And crossing those vast swamps.
Yeah.
It was just, and that was, some of the original drains came by through appropriations from the state legislature, and one of the first ones was in response to Michigan State University. So I think it was probably in the 1860s. So many faculty and staff were out from malaria that the legislature said, we got to do something. So they allocated quite a bit of money to do a number of dredging programs on the Red Cedar. River Raisin, I think, was another one. Down southeast Michigan, the Grand River, and a number of other tributaries.
So is that essentially, so we had all this water, and I know you got the drains, but essentially, is that it? We just moved more water faster away, and that's why our grounds are drier? I'm trying to figure out how we dried out for such a pretty state that's now, got lakes and stuff, but you don't think of your feet getting wet everywhere you walk anymore, Right. It's all because we just have been able to move enough water at a faster rate off the surface. Is that it?
That's right. The original landscape, if you look at some of the pre-settlement vegetation, it really doesn't show much in the way of rivers. I'm sure, the Huron probably was to some extent, but without the development, places like the, along especially the upper parts of the Red Cedar and probably the Shiawassee were probably just series of wetlands. Lots of forested wetlands and just outright swamps, and they probably flowed during the spring and fall when we got the rains.
Sure.
But other than that, there was a lot of just stagnant marsh and maybe some seasonal flow, and so quite a different area back then.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
People don't realize because they can drive to work. As I've always said, if we plugged all the drains that were man-made, most people, I don't know if it was most, but certainly a lot of people wouldn't be living in their homes or be taking a helicopter to work because the roads would be impassable. But we take that for granted.
Yeah.
If everybody took a canoe to work, we'd probably understand it better. But it's pretty fascinating.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So what's the biggest challenge now facing you as a drain commissioner? What do you see the challenges for the future going on right now?
Boy, we work in a lot of arenas. We work in solid waste, wastewater. You may see the battery collections we have, the battery buckets at your local library. We do those collections. And overall, I think one of our biggest concerns is a lot of the regulation on the wastewater and what that's going to drive in this industry. And specifically, it started here in Livingston with the state seizing a local farmers' property and putting them out of business because of PFAS. And my own personal opinion is we've set limits without understanding what the true risks are. And it seems to be a risk issue of the year, for Americans anymore. Eastern equine encephalitis was the big one. Years ago, and we got calls, you've got to fill my well and you've got to drain it because I'm going to get triple E. And then 5 years later, it was West Nile. We forgot about triple E. And then it was some other weird thing. And the entire time, triple E has remained the same as it was when we first got all upset about it, and has actually probably increased a little bit. So
I think that's a societal issue. We get the shock of the first item, and then we kind of get used to it. I mean, as we go through COVID, I think someday we'll talk about COVID like we do the flu, because we'll be over that hump, right? And it won't be gone. It's just we'll be familiar with it,
As a society, we don't really have a great handle on relative risk.
Yes.
I think the risk, your major risks are identified by what the media tells you is the major risks.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're relying on somebody else to tell us rather than finding out. Yeah.
I drank out of hoses as a child, and I admit that freely. And,
I did too.
And there will be some newscasts that that we're going to be goners here pretty soon because of it. So.
Well, bad news, Brian. We are going to die.
Exactly.
I'll just share with us. I was thinking about, you were talking about the wastewater. So wastewater and septics being its own topic. I mean, what is your relationship to those issues?
Well, we manage a number of wastewater systems throughout the county. Our largest one being the sewer that serves both Hartland and Tyrone townships, and that transmits the waste to the Genesee County District 3 plant in Linden.
Oh, okay.
So we have a lot of pump stations. We also have a septic receiving station. That's probably second largest, I understand, in the United States in terms of volume. So we deal a lot with wastewater, and what's coming down, especially because of regulations, I mentioned PFAS, is kind of frightening in terms of where that's going to drive our costs, which when our costs go up to deal with the sludge that we produce,
right,
then it gets all passed on to the users.
Sure.
And so that's probably one of my main concerns is the regulation that's coming through, and it's awfully frightening, and that's not something I've said very often in my career.
Well, and I think, so just to clarify again for folks who listen who may not get the sensitivity of this, is when they have their septics pumped and it goes into a truck and it's driven away, that miracle that goes away is where you take over. They're driving now to the facility that you're managing for them to dump that sludge. In the old days, when we were young, we would watch them drive around farmers' fields and spray it on the fields, and we know that's no longer allowable and appropriate that they now head for your facility. So the sludge you're talking about is coming from everybody, right? That's the point. So, yeah.
Yeah, all the homes, and I think the common number is about 60% of residences here in Livingston County have on-site septic systems.
Yeah.
So the majority have their own. And I would say, at least where the legislation is going in the rules, stay on your septic. That would be the one piece of good advice I think I would say.
Do not hook up.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, Brian, we mentioned early on you're fourth generation in the county. So what did your parents do? What did your family do that made them stay in the county?
Well, we still have the original family farm that was established in 1911.
I will admit I knew that you had the family farm, but I thought you just were
yeah.
Go ahead.
So, my mom and dad still live there on the farm, which is really cool, and we like to maintain that in the family as long as possible. But
nice.
It really interesting to see. And actually, they ended up in North or South Dakota during the years they had no rain, the big Dust Bowl.
Oh, yes.
And we're actually on a train to Texas when they ran into Well, Doc Elliott, you remember Elliott Road is off
Yes.
of Mason
Yes.
Road,
Yeah.
and he says, "Hey, come up to Fowlerville. We got some good land." They turned around and took the train up.
Isn't that
Wow,
cool?
fascinating.
So,
yeah.
That is really cool.
Fascinating.
So yeah, came over on the sister ship, the Mauritania, which is a sister ship to the Lusitania, which
Right.
got us into World War One.
Yep.
And so just a
What a great
neat
history stuff, yeah.
Yeah, great history.
Well, we're getting near the end, so I want to do what I ask everybody who does come from the community. So, what's your favorite thing to do in the county when you have time off?
And where do you leave your waste?
These are waste. We are on sewer at least currently. But, I grew up on the farm and hunting and fishing, and to me, and I saw those resources. If people could see the huge northern pike that I saw in a small branch of the red cedar, and that was important to me. So when I went to school, I went into biology, and I worked on a graduate degree on the St. Lawrence studying the muskie.
Nice.
And ways to help preserve that species out there, which is being impacted. So, and I always knew that as a hunter, my monies went toward conservation. That's the most important aspect of how they fund our DNR. And so that's why I became a biologist. And so hunting is probably, especially
favorite,
spring
yeah.
turkey hunting,
Nice.
and maybe some deer hunting. But as I'm getting older, I'm doing more of the filming. I tell my friends they're too pretty to shoot. So.
Yeah, I have a group of friends who say it's not worth the work once I shot them.
Yeah, exactly. So just being at camp, I think, is the best part of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, and the final question, I kind of told you about this. What's your favorite place to go to have dinner in Livingston County?
That's a tough one. We don't
Yes.
go out a whole lot, but I will say the tried and true, because we grew up with it, and the food is always good.
Yeah.
It's the same, and that's Tomato Brothers. Formerly Gus's.
yeah,
Grew up
what a
as
name.
Gus's, and
Absolutely, right.
it's just always good.
Yep.
Yeah,
it's
and
predictable
a
and
lot of my
delicious,
friends
yeah.
grew up working there, and so that was kind of a big part for me. So there's a lot of
That's fun, yeah.
familiarity
Yeah.
with that. So yeah,
Great
Well, I
family.
know your
too.
wife is a good cook too, so you probably don't need to go out.
right,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, that's gonna say, yeah. Don't have to go out. It's even better.
She's kind of getting like me with hunting. She'd rather not do as much cooking.
Time to start going out.
But she's good at it, yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to make one last plug here before, I know as being a county commissioner, how well your department does, and it's gotten honorable mention for the employees, that they're so good with the public and they answer phone calls. And I know you have a skeleton crew like everyone else in Livingston County does. And so I just want to thank you and your whole department for doing a really great job. And thought I'd just ask you who your favorite commissioner is too, but I guess we don't have time for that, right? No,
We're not ready
I
to
do
get-
really want to
No,
thank you,
thank
because
you.
that is
Yeah,
something
thank you. No,
that
thank
people
you.
aren't
Yeah.
aware of, is just how effective and efficient your department is, and it is service to our residents, and you do a great job with it. So
I think,
thank you.
and that's what it's all about, is having that great staff. They make it all look easy. And when I have somebody that says, I told your guys, I called them, said I was having a problem with my pump, but it could wait till Monday. They said, no, we got to take care of it now. They came out on Christmas Eve, and when I went to bed at midnight, they were still there, and at 6 o'clock, they were there with a smile,
Wow.
and it was 10 below zero.
Wow.
Says this is not right, and my staff will do that, and they enjoy helping people, and I think it's the most important aspect of any of our offices is we like them to enjoy that, and it shows when they're providing service to our constituents.
Well, nice job,
It's
Brian.
vital. Good job.
Well,
Good
again,
leadership.
thank you for everybody listening to Land and Legacy, and thank you to our special guest, Brian Jonckheere, the Drain Commissioner of Livingston County, and that'll be it for today.
Thanks for having me.